now I'd like to have the honor of introducing Casey Rogers. And I could stand here and list all of Casey's accolades and accomplishments. But one of the things I really love about Casey so much is that she is able to infuse her joy and her activism and philanthropy. Her ability to be present, perceptive, and kind is fully integrated into her effectiveness and productivity. She is a pragmatic optimist and sees the complexity of a challenge and leverages her network, her experience, and her resources to create substantial impact. Her holistic approach attracts people from all walks of life, which we can see here tonight, and brings them together in community. And with a focus on women and the environment, she brings a continuity to many different social challenges and inspires the possibility for positive change. Ladies and gentlemen, Casey Rogers.
I'm so happy to be with you tonight. Thank you for spending a bit of time in our home with each other and hearing a few words that I have to share. So let me take you back to a time in my childhood, wind blowing in my face, my legs kicked out over the side of the boat, a big deep breath of fresh air. I think this is where I fell in love with nature and the calming impact of water. So we were sailing, my dad, my brother, and sister. My dad was my biggest critic, and we didn't always see eye to eye. But I know that that helped me hone my opinions and articulate my thoughts. He loved America and living in the Midwest, and he introduced me to worlds outside these borders. But unfortunately, he was gone too soon. My mom remains one of my biggest supporters. She has an uncanny ability of making everyone she is with feel loved and cared for and special. And I'm told that she learned that from her mother. Growing up with my mom was like a master class in family. And she continues to share with us her greatest resource, her time. So in college, I was curious about the world and wanted to immerse myself in as many experiences as I could. So I studied in Denmark and I worked in Germany. And after college, I headed to Namibia in Southwest Africa. And it was in Namibia that I was a fifth grade English teacher, as well as the leader of a girls' club for eighth grade girls. And we would gather every week and we would cook and write, sing and dance, tell stories. And what became very clear to me very quickly is that these very bright young women were hampered by continuing their education for the lack of a few $100s. And it was then that I was struck with an epiphany, that even though I always envisioned my role as a teacher in a classroom, that the impact I wanted to see in the world didn't have to happen in the classroom. It could be activated outside of the classroom, and that, in fact, I could be a connector between needs in communities and possibilities in boardrooms. So in 1999, I founded Deep Roots, which is a nonprofit of international connection and giving across borders, to support girls like Ottilie, who were bright and geared up to pursue secondary education, but again, missing a small amount of money. And so I got together with my two other co-founders, a group of volunteers, and we created a response to this. Deep Roots began in Namibia, expanded to Zambia, Guatemala, and Nepal, and spanned 10 years. And we were very young then, and we went for it. We weren't intimidated by what we didn't know. We kept staying curious, tweaking, adjusting, never letting perfect be the enemy of the good. And you'd be amazed what can happen with that kind of attitude. In fact, I was hitchhiking one day and got a ride from a corporate executive in a very fancy Mercedes. We had a 4-hour ride together, so I thought, let me tell him about Deep Roots. And when we got to our destination, he said, I'm so impressed, I want to give you $10,000 for Deep Roots. And I said, you do? He was more confident in me at that moment than I was in myself. But this was an affirmation that I was on the right track and that really I should keep going. So this started a journey that honestly has exceeded my expectations. It was a moment where my love of Africa was cemented, as was my ability, or my belief that I had an ability to address injustice. So I moved back to the United States, moved to Los Angeles, and got my dream job. Program officer at the Hilton Foundation. And in my final interview with Steve Hilton, who was the president at the time, he said, Casey, you are so young. Why do you want to work in philanthropy? And I said, Steve, philanthropy is the creative space. This is where new ideas can be incubated and tested, where risks can be taken. It's entrepreneurship for humanity, and where solid ideas can be scaled. Take, for example, the Hilton Early Head Start training program. This was a public-private partnership between the Hilton Foundation and the US government. Maybe you're familiar with Head Start, the national program which provides early childhood education to low-income American children. Well, there was a mandate that Head Start include infants and toddlers with disabilities, but programs had no idea how to do this. In comes the Hilton Early Head Start training program to train educators and parents across the country on how to include infants and toddlers with disabilities in early childhood settings. With a multi-year commitment of millions of dollars, trainings were developed and held across the country. And over the span of a few years, more than 20,000 infants and toddlers were indeed included in Head Start programs, which had a ripple effect to more than 100,000 people across the country. And those training materials and curriculum were still able to be used years into the future. Now, while I was at the Hilton Foundation, I got to know a bit about this man, Conrad Hilton, who was the founder of the Hilton Foundation. He left most of his estate to form the foundation. And at the time, he was one of the best-known businessmen in America. And one of his values was to always create a win-win deal. He never wanted to gouge the other party. He wanted both parties to come out of a transaction feeling like they got a good deal. Win-win. Now, in the philanthropic and social sector, it doesn't always feel win-win, right? There's a huge imbalance when it comes to resources and access. So if you want to create win-win, you need to have a high level of intentionality, that is indeed your intent, and you then can build around that. So for example, at the Hilton Foundation, nonprofits were offered low-interest loans. This is something called a program-related investment. It is indeed a win-win. The nonprofit receives below-market financing that they couldn't get from a bank or traditional lenders, and the foundation is able to meet its payout requirement and do it in a mission-related way. Win-win. Now, all of these experiences really culminated in 2018 when I launched the Ellen Fund with Ellen and Portia, focused on conservation for endangered species. This was announced on the Ellen Show, and the initial investment was a 12-acre campus in northern Rwanda focused on training the next generation of African conservationists. The intent was not only to train the next generation, but it was to build a sustainably built campus. It was to employ a large number of local workforce and to return the ecosystem to this land which had been agricultural. Now, this campus, which now exists, and if you're ever in northern Rwanda, please go and visit, was made possible because of this transformative partnership between these three organizations. The Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, which is the owner and operator of the campus, the Ellen Fund, which was the lead investor in the campus, and Mass Design Group, which was both the designer as well as the general contractor. This was never a building project. This was to be a transformative endeavor which had equity baked into it from the start. And when I say that, how that came to be was that every decision was considered through a lens of equity. Who was being employed? Where were materials being sourced? Who was the project leadership? And ultimately, who would benefit from the campus? Well, I am very happy that the campus is a reality. But what we found out while thousands of workers were building the campus was that a global pandemic struck. And there was a volcanic eruption 100 miles away across the border in Goma, and supply chain breakdowns occurred, and overnight, the budget increased 35%. What saved this project is that there was that mutual agreement by the three parties I mentioned, the Fossey Fund, the Ellen Fund, and Mass, that the mission of the project is what we were focused on. And the mission was about equity, it was about the next generation, it was about preservation of wildlife and wild spaces, and that mattered enough to do exceedingly hard things to make this project happen. So 2 years ago, the Ellen campus opened, and since then, there have been over 60,000 visitors, 10,000 of whom are local school children. 12 students have been accepted in PhD programs and are living abroad, studying. Over 250,000 native species have been planted on the campus, and the ecosystem is returning. And in total, 2,400 local workers were employed, many of whom during COVID, to construct the campus, 600 of whom were women. And what I'm particularly proud about is that the women workers at the end of their work each had a bit of personal savings. So charity is nice, but I would like to work for justice, for transformation. And that can come about and happen because of intentional transformational partnerships. So about 15 years ago, I had an idea to start a consulting firm. But the path went in different directions. And ultimately, that plan came to life in January 2023 with the creation of Telea Insights, which is, as you heard a little bit about, a consulting firm accelerating social change. So we work with donors, advising on philanthropy, and we also work with nonprofit leaders on strategy, operations, and executive coaching. Over the last 18 months, we've worked with a number of clients, but just to give you a sample, in the case of Daughters for Earth, we've architected their grant-making program and overseen over $4 million of investments in women-led climate action. With RSO Foundation, we've been a philanthropic advisor. With African Women Rising, we've led their strategic planning process and their board retreats, all to drive change that we know is possible in the world. Now, we've talked about the creative space and scaling. We've talked about win-win. We've talked about this transformational partnership. Now we'll turn to talk about who makes the decisions about the money. So in the case of Daughters for Earth, which I mentioned is a client of Telea Insights, they are focused, as Caitlin mentioned earlier, on funding, mobilizing and celebrating women-led action to protect Earth. And they provide grants to women on the front lines of climate action around the world. And initially, it was staff in New York and LA who were directing these grant dollars. Professional, well-intentioned, and no experience in conservation or regenerative agriculture or climate advocacy. And we realized we need to flip this. We need to intentionally create a decision-making system where women who have expertise in conservation and climate advocacy and regenerative agriculture and live in proximity to climate hotspots are indeed the ones making grant-making decisions. Enter the Wise Daughters Council, 9 women who come together on an annual basis and at this point have directed $4 million to women-led climate actions in 50 countries. We flipped the traditional script, and rather than going the norm in how many decisions are made throughout philanthropy, the decision was now in the hands of people closest to the challenge we were aiming to address. And it was very interesting because one of the women on the Wise Daughters Council said to us after the first year, "I didn't really think that you would take our recommendations." And I said, "Really? Tell me more." She said, "Oh, I've been part of these kind of processes before. And they tell you that you're making a decision, but really it's more like a suggestion. And sometimes your decision gets changed." I said, "Noted. These are final decisions. That's the difference." So I like to say that money matters. And I don't ever want anybody to think that money doesn't matter. So give, right? But when we think about capital, money is one piece of it. And there are so many other types that can be activated to really bring forward substantial change. And this is where I have to introduce you to Richard Atlas, former client, and in my estimation, one of the best examples of harnessing your power. So Richard was an investment banker. He started Goldman Sachs' office in Los Angeles, and he retired early. And when he retired, he and his wife, Leslie, dedicated themselves to advocating on behalf of infants and toddlers in our country. Really, it was the early years for Richard that mattered. And this was before any of the research had been done on the strong ROI to investing in young children. But Richard knew this to be true as a good investment, a numbers guy, right, from his career. And he was able to call together the mayor of Los Angeles and business leaders in Los Angeles to meet him for breakfast or lunch to talk about the importance of investing in young children and how that would have economic benefits to the city of Los Angeles. And they came. He was able to harness his sharp intellect, his massive network, his credibility as a business leader, and his grant dollars to advance change. Today, there is the Los Angeles Early Childhood Initiative, which is a multi-million-dollar fund which is seeding and helping scale interventions for early childhood services for children in Los Angeles. A really fitting testament to Richard's legacy. So he reminds us of what it looks like to bring our whole selves. And, you know, as much as everyone in this room is engaged, as we heard in the very beginning, in philanthropy and social impact, the question of how do we bring our whole selves, we can keep asking and answering. I don't believe we ever should finish answering that question, regardless of how senior we are or how advanced we are. So we touched on activating at a large scale this principle of win-win, of really going for transformational partnerships, of questioning who decides and then even changing the decision-making process. And lastly, leveraging all the capital we have to bring to bear. You know, there's so many ways to be involved in philanthropy, right? It's a spectrum. Everything from families talking about spend, save, share, and holiday giving, to giving circles where your money goes further because you're the collective, to businesses deciding that they're going to give, or they're going to give their employees funds to direct, to donor-advised funds. And if you purely like the for-profit space, there's impact investing so that you can stay in the business sector but have a social benefit. And within the foundation realm, there are so many questions to ask. In addition to who decides on where the funding goes, can you exceed your 5% payout? Can you leverage all your assets? There's space for all of us. And I believe that what you have to offer and what we have to offer is something impressive. The world can use more of it. I reckon the world can't wait, actually. And I call on us to do it. Thank you.